All right, we should be live in just a moment. Let me just wait for the little notification so we're not doing a choppy, weird thing for the people watching. All right, here we go. Happy Monday, everybody. It is Monday, October 13th, and this is the Solid Ground live stream, which is a stream that we do every Monday morning at 10 a.m. Pacific, which is all kinds of different times for everybody here because we're all on different time zones. But it's lovely to see you all. I'm Leslie Elliott Boyce, and I'm joined by the usual suspects. I've got Jennifer Friend, Jenny Holland, and we're happy to have Deborah Knox with us today after missing you for a couple of weeks, Deborah. And we have a lovely guest with us today. We have Mazy Edwin joining us. Mazy and I had a conversation that I posted to this channel in the last couple of months, fairly recently. And it was a really great conversation about the philosophy behind transgenderism, the what's going on with gender, and some of Mazy's experiences as a trans and detrans person. Mazy identified as a male for 14 years and was a pretty convincing man we met actually, was just something that was really funny. When we were talking, we discovered that we'd actually met previously. And so what an experience in and of itself. And I feel like with all the discussions of male, female, like the war of the sexes stuff that's going on, having lived through a long chunk of young adulthood, having people interact with you as if you are male, and then still as a young adult coming back to your natal gender and identifying as female and having people interact with you as if you're a woman. What an interesting experience that must be as well. So I know that's not really the focus of today's conversation, although if people want to ask about it, I think it would be interesting to hear more. And let's see. Hello in the chat. Caravaggio is glad Deborah's back with a big heart. Nice to see you guys. And Area Hermit Woman is also glad to have you back, Deborah. Deborah, since you're here, do you want to introduce Solid Ground for everybody before we
Yes, so not
move on?
having learned it.
Yeah.
Excuse me, I've got a little cold too. Solid Ground is a peer support community for anyone concerned about the imposition of critical social justice and/or authoritarian measures such as medical mandates in their workplace, university, children's schools, or community. We offer weekly online peer support groups in which members share ideas, thoughts, and support for how to navigate the impact of these ideologies and answer the question, where do we go from here? You can join our peer support groups for $10 a month, and you can join our forum on locals for $5 a month. If you want to learn more, you can go to Solid Ground Locals for the forum and go to Solid Ground Substack to find out more about the peer support groups. Thank you for your attention to this matter.
Thank you,
Sorry.
Deborah. And you and me both I have a cold, so excuse my voice, everybody, today, and I'll try to cough off mic if I have to cough. So many questions. So Jay Adams says, "Oh boy, the trans community hate the detrans." And I know there's a lot of politicizing of all of this, but we're kind of trying to cut through that and search for more understanding. And Mazy, you've done a lot of thinking about this. I guess the question is, what is transgenderism? What does it mean? Why are people so drawn to it? And you have a lot of thoughts about this. And so I'll get out of your way and let you talk.
Yeah, I mean I'm working on a project that is pretty big, and sometimes it can be quite disorienting. I think the topic's disorienting for a lot of people, and it just naturally unfolds where you end up falling down a rabbit hole, and then all of a sudden you're lost and you have to reset and start again. And that's kind of the situation I'm in now. It's a work in progress, and it feels like this really big project. It's almost like overwhelming. And one of the things that I keep coming back to right now is this weird sense that the topic appears like hypergender, that it has everything to do with gender, and we can see it kind of interacting with the feminist movement, or maybe compare it to an older time period. People had traditional gender roles. We can view this through a hypergendered lens, and I think that's kind of relevant in its own area, but I think that you can completely reframe it to be through a non-gendered lens, and that would reveal a lot of things that I think people aren't seeing or that may be counterintuitive. And in fact, once I did that, I also realized that people having like a hyper-gendered experience, so far my kind of working cobbled together loose ideas are that sometimes people have a hypergendered experience as a direct result of trauma, and I think it really relates to like your family and your culture. And I worked in youth mentorship and youth crisis outreach for a while, and I lived in a transitional program when I was a teenager, and so that's also extremely relevant. And what I find is it feels like uh, there really is no clear cultural identity anymore. People can name subcultures, but they don't always get along, and it's very complicated and it's completely incoherent. So it really feels like there's this bigger picture here where, people talk about the broken family, and it's like families are falling apart and there's a lot of chaos. And if you're a child in that, you're born into that situation, you're born into the middle of the story as it's falling apart. So then things are incoherent and they don't make sense. And something I've noticed about my childhood, if I use myself as a case study, is that I didn't internalize almost anything I experienced in childhood, and a lot of it really didn't make sense to me. And it was honestly a protective measure. I'm extremely lucky because I see a lot of young people that do internalize things from their childhood that it's not good for them. There's maybe abuse or there's drug use or it's single parenthood or et cetera, et cetera. And when that happens, they are become fractured and you're basically a wanderer. You have no place you belong, no particular clear identity. You don't really understand how to form your identity in relation to other people, and you become what I call the wanderer. And you have to go out in the world and figure out things completely on your own, which is what I had to do when I was 14. So some people then become hypergendered. So like you look at, say, the feminist movement, some of the way they talk, especially second wave onward, like the way my mother talked, feels very traumatized. Like they
Mm.
are paranoid, don't trust men with anything. You should have a career and be completely hyper independent so that if you bring a man into your life, you're always in a position of power because they saw maybe sometimes they saw their mothers rendered dependent on an abusive man, and they didn't want to be in that situation. So there's this breaking down of the family, and when things get broken, you end up in a hyper-gendered situation where your identity is like traumatized. It's a traumatic ego identity that becomes more gendered than it normally would be.
Hmm.
So that's kind of the starting place I'm working with here.
Can I ask a really quick question? When you're saying gendered and hyper-gendered, what do you
Mhm.
actually mean?
It comes out in a variety of different ways, and I think that there's a feedback loop. So what I wrote down some stuff here as like to help work out some of my ideas. And under normal, healthy, ideal conditions, a culture is like a relay race and it passes down, from family to family. The parents can pass down something to their kids and grandkids and onward. And there's positive relationships, that's the relay race. But I kind of see this thing happening in recent history. You could say it's at least I don't know what you would put the parameters as, but it's at least becomes noticeable in the last maybe 200 years. And to simplify, I wrote it down as, um, maybe initially have like people look back to the 1950s in the West or, especially like America, and you see what people think of as, old-fashioned conservative, but that itself is also honestly pretty modern. That's where we get like the nuclear family. And in my research, that's already technically a form of a broken family. So we used to be more intergenerational, three generations, and we used to be more communal in a tribe. So you start with what I've now termed mid-century modern conservative, like the nuclear family, and I get this sense looking at history and like listening to different people talk that there is a lot of trauma from that era. And I mean, there were two world wars, and there was millions of men either killed or traumatized, and then they come back home. And I think this has a huge impact. And then you get, I've always paid close attention to the second wave feminist movement, that's an example to me of something becoming hypergendered. And they form a completely different working theory of men and women and also of history. They have these claims of, women were oppressed for thousands of years throughout history, and that's painting with a very broad brush. And I question, how does that compare to people in those time periods viewing their own lives? It's just an example. So I view the feminist movement as an example of something being hypergendered. Then you get to the 90s and the 2000s, and I'm a young millennial. Me and my sister grew up with a mother that was broadly like second wave feminist. And it seemed like she had a chip on her shoulder, like this like traumatic identity of like always having this unresolved issue with men, and men suck and I hate men and men are pigs and don't trust any man, and they're predatory, they're patriarchal, and it's all these different things. So I grew up with that without any direct exposure to what created that belief system in the first place. So then that creates a hypergendered experience for me and my sister. And
by hypergendered, you mean that there's an extreme salience to the idea of gender and its importance in your identity and in your cultural experience broadly.
yeah, it seems like there's things that get passed through a filter of gender, and there's an intense focus on it, and things become perceived as more about gender than they necessarily need to be. That's part of the theme I've come up with. Because, like, you have to imagine I was born into this experience, and I was one of the people that perceived myself as a boy from my earliest memories. And so that's kind of an odd experience, I guess. I mean, it was my normal, it's all I knew. But my earliest memories weren't, oh, I'm a girl and I want to be a boy. My earliest memories were, why am I being singled out from other boys and humiliated and emasculated and like, forced to wear dresses and bullied by my mother, et cetera, et cetera. And so,
So you had a really deep conviction that you were a boy.
yeah, and I mean, if you're a little kid, you don't necessarily have sophisticated language to explain these things. You just sort of start experiencing stuff, and it sort of feels like you're waking up in the middle of the story, is the description I would say.
Hmm. Hmm.
So just so I get back to the question, I think salience was maybe a good word, Leslie, too. There's like, if we're gonna have an explanatory factor, people are, like you said, it's either the lens everyone's looking for, or it's the explanation for everything. And then I'm wondering if you were thinking too, if you've got people who are traumatized and in some sort of developmental stage ego formation, that is a thing to grab onto. Am I this? Am I that? And get extra either neurotic about it or whatever the case may be. I don't know if that's really not the best word, but I think you know what I mean.
Hmm. Yeah, you're the second person I've heard bring this up recently, about how generationally maybe the mid 1900s would have been in terms of gender or sex political disagreement or conflict was really impacted by the wars that had occurred leading up to that period. The first was, I think it was Adam Lane Smith, who does a lot of work on attachment theory. Okay, so you're familiar. So I heard him talking on a podcast, and he mentions this trajectory wherein a lot of men let's just talk about the Western world, maybe the US, had been through generations of combat. You look at the Civil War, you look at the World Wars, and some of these conflicts that had that had killed a lot of young men and had left a lot of families fatherless, and had also brought back home a lot of very deeply wounded, physically, spiritually, and mentally speaking men to reintegrate into family life. And so there was this like wave of several generations of deeply traumatized people, or killed, missing people. And so you have this feminist movement that starts to pick up speed based on the experiences of women that they actually could not depend on a man because he was dead, because he was deeply, deeply wounded, and that they needed to be able to head their families in those with those conditions. So that was an interesting, I'm not sure if I'm giving his argument, if I'm doing it any credit right now, or if I'm kind of glossing over it, but I found it to be a really interesting argument because it sort of explains, it offers an explanation of how we got where we ended up in the middle of the 1900s. So you're bringing that up as well. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the working phrases I had, if I want to just like gloss over the big picture and kind of come up with different themes, because, I mean, there's LGBT culture and what they claim is important, and they have like their values. It's a unique movement, the unique subculture. That's on my little chart here, as well. And I was thinking, well, I never really fit in with LGBT culture. I lived as a straight man for 14 years, and I'm almost exclusively attracted to women, although I married a man, and that's another rabbit hole for a different time as well. uh, and well, so my working concept, and I've had this little phrase for a couple years now since early detransition, and that happened shortly after my really intense otherworldly spiritual transformation. And this was the idea that it actually has much more to do with three things than gender itself. It only has to do with gender, or like looks like that's the theme over and over again, when we're operating from a traumatized experience, or we're broken, or we feel lost, or specifically alienated. When we feel alienated, I think that's important. When you start to get on a path that is towards healing, truth, empowerment, where things are coming together, coalescing, I think it's actually much more about health, nature, and spirituality. I'm a very spiritual person, and it's an oddity in my life that's part of the Rubik's Cube I'm trying to figure out here, that I've had really intense spiritual experiences after growing up in a mostly non-religious culture where I'm from. I mean, you can find it if you look for it, but you really have to look. Uh, and yet, most of those spiritual experiences, even though I felt like I was discovering deep truth, and I was, and it felt extremely physical too. That's something that's really essential. It did not feel like, oh, this is mostly mental. It felt like viscerally, whole body, otherworldly, everything. Most of them did not cause my detransition. It was only the last really big one that was really beyond anything else. It's almost beyond words. And I guess that's what ultimately led me to uh, this thing I'm trying to figure out, is that what I am and what I've been, if you take it in total, there is no real working theory that explains that. Because, on my little chart here, I have that little section LGBT culture, and there is a split in LGBT culture between the born this way kind of biological view of it, that's very absolute. You're born this way, gay or trans, etc. And this kind of new thing that is more about gender as a social construct, where they break down categories entirely. And I'm looking at it thinking, the one thing that LGBT culture has no room for is the idea that people actually potentially could evolve. And that is still pretty taboo. And that's, I think someone said, trans people hate detrans people. It's usually because of that. Because if you evolve, that is extremely threatening because of the premise that you're born this way. And
Yeah.
so for some reason I evolved, and it's
There's a really interesting story about of LGBT lore. So Oscar Wilde, who's probably the most famous gay man ever to live, and was infamously embroiled in a very long love affair with this young man called Bosie. I forget his full name now. He was a sort of a nobleman. And that's what caused Oscar Wilde's imprisonment and all that story. But later in life, and I know this because I read Douglas Murray's biography of Wilde, Bosie became straight. One of the most famous sort of young homosexual men in the world, married a woman and had a child and was an utterly devoted father. Um, when he was out of his beautiful young man phase, when he kind of grew into the more sort of solid middle age. That's a very interesting thing. I was going to leave it at that. So go on. Sorry. So they don't
That's an
like that.
awesome little side story because it
Yeah.
goes right back to my working theory that this has much more to do with family or the
Yeah.
breakdown and loss of family. And once the family's broken down and we lose that, then especially if you're a child, then your entire development and maybe various aspects of self-perception, self-identity, maybe even your perception of your own human nature goes down a completely different path than it would have otherwise. And the story you told sounds like when this guy got older, there was an evolution that maybe it just took a long time, but there was this unexpected evolution that ended up with something surprisingly conventional.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, I think also I think when just from being a young remembering what it was like when I was young, and it was a very different time. Very, very different. But I think universally, young people are very self-involved and they're very self-obsessed. And like to a narcissistic degree, even if you're not a narcissist, even if you don't stay a narcissist, you're young, you're beautiful. You hang out with other young people who are beautiful. And I don't mean like model beautiful. I mean just the flush of youth. And it's intoxicating. It feels empowering, even though what you really are is you're vulnerable and weak in the world because you're making your first steps out into adult world. You don't know what you're doing. And if you don't have family support, 10 times more. So you're in this weird space, this sort of like liminal space where you feel physically powerful, physically intoxicated and intoxicating. But actually you're still like a baby horse foal, like taking those wobbly steps. And when culture encourages a natural maturation, when society and culture encourage a natural maturation, there's already a pre-walked path to that end. And when you're deracinated from that, as you were saying in the beginning, very interestingly, it gets even easier to be caught up in the maelstrom of this idea that you are a malleable person who's own like this the physical element and the image element, the narcissistic element is the most important. It becomes like almost like a trap, maybe.
I would say that I think it's possible that young people are more narcissistic if the culture's falling apart, and because there's a search for meaning and there's a void. And I've always been extremely social and extroverted, and because my health was really bad when I was growing up, and I had a lot of pain, and so I didn't exactly have the same experience of youth as other people. That's another factor here, I would say, is maybe comorbidities or pre-existing conditions. And I fought really hard to um, basically save my life. And that's not just a phrase I'm using to be like pro-trans. I'm using it in a little bit different way here. Nobody was looking after my health, and people were denying those issues. So I fought really hard when I was about 14 to 17 to essentially escape the situation I was born into and to beg for medical help. That's how that manifested. And so uh, once it felt like I unlocked my, hero's journey. If you think of Joseph Campbell, the classic hero's journey, I felt like I unlocked that. And the traditional hero's journey starts with the hero as the fool, who's like now coming into adolescence, but he's grown up in his village, and he has to leave the village behind and embark into the wilderness and the greater unknown world to go on this big journey that becomes this like deep spiritual evolution. And he eventually returns to the village with his wisdom, knowledge, and new discovery of truth. For people that are born into these increasingly incoherent, broken, aimless, almost like anti-cultures, broken family and so forth, their form of the hero's journey, I think, is when they leave behind that broken world that doesn't even feel like a real coherent, village, tribe, community, and they're basically a wanderer. And if you have that many people that are wanderers that are from this like fractured childhood, eventually you get a whole lot of them that find each other. And that's where you get these new movements where there's this presumption that everything new is good and everything old is bad. That's the nature of like progressivism, is
Mhm.
what I call it. Or you might get like the feminist movement. All of these young women had experiences where they related to each other and they started forming their own working theories of the world and of history. And then you even get this with LGBT culture, that they formed a whole new working theory of gender and the world and on and on. And what I have in my chart at the end of this like crazy snaking journey is that if we find our way back, we find, the hero's journey back to the village, and, the village is broken, it's gone, we effectively have to find our way to starting a whole new village, whole new foundation. And so the story you told about, I forget the name of the guy that Oscar Wilde,
Bozy.
Bose. Um, so in a way, that is an example of this. And maybe it has some similarities to my situation where I was a trans man for a very long time. I professionally worked in youth mentorship. So here's a whole system built with a whole working theory of youth empowerment that's outside of forming families. It's an alternative. It's this
Mm.
naturally arising alternative. And all of a sudden I do transition and I end up married to a man and we're going through the adoption system now and we're going to adopt 3 kids. So it's
Wow.
weirdly conventional. And so there's this like theme where it seems like if it's like, for example, in LGBT culture, I think that culture is falling apart. I think it's becoming extremely self-destructive. And I think it's partially because uh they're becoming so antagonistic to parts of human nature that they don't deem as acceptable. Like it's bad to be conventional. It's bad to get older and evolve as a person and find you're now falling into a conventional role. And even, you hear this among gay people that are in like the party scene when they're young, that narcissistic, youthful shtick. And oh, we have to go to the club. We're gonna have tons of random hookups. We're gonna be polyamorous. We're gonna do lots of drugs, blah, blah, blah. And as they get older, I especially have heard this from gay men I've been friends with, they have an identity crisis because they want to settle down and adopt kids and have a family, or they don't know what to do with themselves. There's like an end of the road with this
Mm.
journey where you have to find your way back home to that lost tribe that's been like broken.
Yeah, that's amazing. I very much agree with that. I've seen that happen. That's very, very interesting.
You know what I'm also thinking too, as you talk, because there's so much that talk about, well, your chosen family, and you've talked about the cult dynamics. It's, well, maybe if you had a natural born family, there'd be these ways that you can't think your own way. But like going these chosen families seems like they're so, because the loyalties aren't based on blood, they're more ideological, and there's almost this extra stranglehold or something that you better keep in line with the view that we're all sharing. If you don't, you're not loyal. Like there's not going to be that blood is thicker than water because there's no blood there, right? So then it's the ideological thing that they can kind of keep people more tightly roped in. I don't know if there's something to that.
Um, yeah, I mean, okay, so when it comes to cult-like behavior, things being ideologically driven, I suppose part of my worldview is based on the fact that I've been thrown into extreme far leftist environments. I'm from Minneapolis, and I had to survive these environments and coexist, but I never believed in their ideology personally. And so there's that. And then when you throw LGBT as kind of part of the overarching culture, it's very, very popular here. And we grew up with it where it was not only normal, but it was extremely popular. And so I've noticed uh, there's this kind of love bombing trait in LGBT culture, more so than any other part of broadly left-wing culture I've experienced. And it does feel very culty. And something that I think explains why I never fit in with this, and I've always been like at odds with broad left-wing culture, is that there is a type of transgender person that is actually extremely gender conforming and it's intrinsically driven. So previous movements that have theories on gender, like this idea that we're always radically rejecting norms and we're going to break free of these norms and we're just going to be, I don't know, queer and have no clear identity. I'm an outsider looking in. I honestly feel like an old man trying to explain LGBT sometimes because it's not my thing. I don't relate to it. And so like here I am. I lived for a very long time as a man and I passed really well. The only thing that was particularly different is that I was short and skinny. Most of the time, people didn't know I was trans, and I didn't think it was particularly relevant to go around announcing it. And then here you have this LGBT movement that has the rainbow flag that literally puts on parades, and they want to take people like me and put us as their show pony in the front of their parade and celebrate all the features of us that we didn't choose, that we didn't want. Where I'm like, okay, I appear androgynous, or I appear like a Peter Pan, or like a weird, like old man hobbit, and not like a regular man. But I didn't choose that. I didn't want that. I want to be just a regular dude and just be with my guy friends. That's how I connect. And so there's this subgroup of trans people that I think are seen as like real trans. It's intrinsically driven. There's not a lot of ideology with it. It was just a strong desire to like is driven by instinct to like be who you are and to look well normal. And you're very gender conforming. And LGBT culture no longer really speaks for a lot of people who would be either gay, lesbian, or trans. And that's it's falling apart now, and so it's becoming its own complete entity that's very culty, and it only speaks for a certain subsect of people. It does not speak for the vast majority, I think, anymore.
Wow.
Oh, interesting.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
What do you think the connection is, if any, between what you were saying, describing your mother's sort of chip on her shoulder, I'd say strident second wave feminism, and your early and very strong identification as a boy? Do you think there's a connection there?
Yeah, I think she made it worse. I mean, I don't think she would have understood that. My parents didn't really know what transgender was. So there is a lot of things that just are unfolding organically that are unintentional. And as part of my little chart here, when I was writing through kind of the feminist section of things, it shows the move from the 1950s to the feminist movement. Then we get to the 90s, and a lot of people have pointed this out, like in TV shows when I was growing up, there was the wife and mother that had this very strong, almost aggressive, dominant personality. And then the father was like the bumbling fool that was like passive and just there for comedic relief. So I grew up with that, and uh, like I remember the TV show Everybody Loves Raymond, and my parents thought it was hilarious, and I just hated it. It just it just was so in your face with that trope, and it hit too close to home. So my dad, I would describe him as just a teddy bear. He's like a kid at heart. I actually think I get a lot of my personality traits from him, and I lived as a man for a long time and I worked with kids, and I would find that sometimes the jokes I would make with kids, or the way I talk and I'm goofy, was very similar to my dad. And I'm still kind of like that, even though people now see me as a woman and I might be somewhat androgynous personality wise, but people don't necessarily see me as masculine. And so I had this idea that there was a bit of a role reversal with my parents, and I think there's a lot of millennials that have experienced this and some Gen X. I've
Yeah,
met
I
people
experience
recently
this.
where this is a theme, and you'll see this trend where if there's an aggressive mother that tries to force uh visual femininity, like kind of surface level, like okay, wear dresses, do makeup, this like hyper femininity, there's that hypergendered thing again. And yet it's paired with this like really aggressive personality. The mother is like my mother is very personality wise very masculine and very aggressive and domineering, and yet wanted to enforce this visual look that was hyper feminine. And then my dad was very nurturing and loving. So I think that there's a lot of confusion in that for a lot of people, even if for those who are not transgender, I think it affects a lot of people. And the child may subconsciously relate to the person who's exhibiting those deeper personal qualities that maybe normally associate with a certain gender, and now it's flipped. So I've felt this bond with my dad that had this nurturing set of qualities that was playful, it was goofy, it was loving. And I felt absolutely no connection to my mother being very aggressive. And it was, so I guess people would say I was tomboyish as a kid if they want to interpret it that way. But I think we have a real problem with surface level hyper femininity being kind of forced on girls by mothers who are feminists. This is like part of the trend. It's people might think it's ironic. Uh, but the deeper qualities behind that are like
Yeah.
aggressive and not feminine. And so like I know myself and a lot of women I met who've experienced that, we tend to be visually very tomboyish or very like plain and like nature oriented, and personality be very loving and nurturing. And when I was living as a man, that came out in a masculine way where I was like always have my friends back, I'm there for you, bro. And it didn't necessarily look feminine. And then I detransition, and all of a sudden now it comes out in a way that looks feminine.
So we have a couple of people who are dying to know what you think, Jennifer. Danny 7190 says, dying to know what Jennifer is thinking. And then Clue Studio says that he thinks your thoughts will violate the terms of service. So yeah.
I'm really curious about, you were talking earlier about finding your way back home, and I was wondering for you, was detransitioning part of you finding your way back home?
Yeah, that was the like grand finale to that whole journey, and I didn't know it would happen. So detransition was not something I chose to do or even understood or comprehended how to do. I had no idea. I mean, if you live as a man as long as I did and you perceive yourself that way, I essentially never lived as a woman before. And then when I was growing up, things aren't quite gendered as much or the same way when you're still growing up. And then I didn't perceive myself as a girl ever. Um, so this is the first time in my life I've experienced being a woman for about 2.5 years now. And so I'm also a musician and a composer, and I started in classical music and kind of branched out, and I do like genre mixing now. And eventually, I taught myself to sing and play guitar, and that came a little bit later. And I started writing songs about 9 years ago that had lyrics. And the very first song I wrote that had lyrics was written in the middle of my other biggest spiritual experience that I was getting into Eastern religions at the time, and so at the time I would describe it as an ego death. You don't completely get rid of the ego, and you don't really you don't need to. Some people think enlightenment means that you completely get rid of your ego. I don't think that's practical or necessary, but the way I describe ego death is like if you look at the hero's journey, halfway down the circle, there's the death and rebirth section. So we go through this progressive spiral in our evolution, ideally towards truth, growth, being more at peace internally. So for me, this ego death experience I had was technically uh, a transformation. So the ego doesn't go away, it just becomes more at peace, less maybe tortured, is how I would describe it, less tortured, more at peace. And it looks like it can disappear because it's no longer a problem. It's no longer a chip on your shoulder. And we go back to that hypergendered thing that when we are properly integrated and we feel empowered and at peace as human beings, gender dissolves into the fray of everything we're doing. And it no longer is a problem that just stands out. And so that first song I wrote in the middle of that experience is called A Man on a Mission to Infinity. I had no clue that there's a lot that happened in that 9 years. There's no way I would have predicted it. not just the detransition, but everything in between. And I started to look at a lot of my songs and notice that there's very distinct and specific things in these songs that like build towards something. And it seems like it was predicting something very deep and very spiritual. So that's another reason I want to say that this is ultimately, in the bigger picture, non-gendered and has to do with health, nature, and spirituality. Because there was one other song, I'll highlight a little piece of it. It's called The Thread of Diome. That one I wrote in August of 21, 4 years ago, so I was still a trans man then. Diome is a sound I sing in the song. It doesn't have a like clear meaning. It's more of like a return to home. It's this wide open sound of feeling completely present. And people often, like if you do like the sound Om, a lot of Eastern religions will say this is the purest sound. And so it doesn't have a very strong meaning. It doesn't have to fully make concrete sense. But in that song, there's this character, and I guess the character is loosely me. And this character is in a forest, and all of a sudden all these ghosts appear. And the original lyric said, "In a shadowed forest, ghosts appear before us, calling your name. Through your eyes, they recognize one thing. You are them, they are you. Two lives tied, one thread running through." And what's unique about this is that it's the only time I've ever changed my lyrics. One of my closest friends at the time said the audience would connect with it more if you made it a singular person. Them was multiple ghosts, but once my friend said you should make it her or she. And so just for no particular reason other than thinking, oh, that sounded good for the story, I changed it. So now the changed version says it's this whole spiritual journey through this like deep internal abyss this person goes through. And the beginning of that journey, now the lyrics are changed to, "In a shadowed forest, ghosts appear before us, calling your name. Through your eyes, they recognize one thing. You are her, she is you. Two lives tied by one thread running through."
You know, going back to there's somebody here says, Leader Holmes, I can't imagine paying this much attention to myself and my gender. And that makes me think of something you said, which I thought was very interesting about narcissism and cultural decline, and how there is a search for meaning that kind of goes along with that. So I think about, so in my cold addled brain, I hope this comes out coherently. We in Gen X, you know, one of the things that was really important to us when we were kids was never being a poser. You had to be authentic. So you didn't see people show up at school with a brand new identity. They had to have like, this had to be tied to like, I was always this way. You know, there was something, people were really allergic to the idea that people would try on a new identity and just show up wearing a costume. It was really gauche. I don't know if you guys relate to that, but that was kind of the way it was when the worst thing you could be was somebody just putting on an identity. And now you see that all the time. It's part of this, it's part of the youth culture and young people to show up wearing a new identity. Like the idea that you would come in and say, I'm going to be this name. I mean, we would have just been like, oh my gosh, no. But now that's just the way things are done. And it's as if through wearing a costume, you can become a different thing. And you can tie yourself into something deeper through external trappings and through aesthetics. So that's really interesting to me. It kind of shows I guess a shallowness of connection to anything relating to a deeper culture. I had another thought, but yeah, anyway. So student of rhythm says, I think it's a he. He remembers that. Thank you, student. Yeah, and then James from Bahia says he likes hearing the spiritual side to your story, Mazy, and the unusual family side of things. Yeah, some interesting feedback there. David LeBoy, Leslie, that was about the best look of feigned disdain I have ever seen. You're a great actress. Thanks.
Leslie, you know what you're just saying about the Gen X thing and how being sort of fake was the worst thing you could do. That I completely agree with that. And I've had a similar thought when Maisie was starting to talk and to that commenter, like young people in millennials and younger seem very self-absorbed. But but I've just thought of something. I've just thought of a shallowness and a weakness in the sort of Gen X mentality, which I am unabashedly biased in favor of overall, because I am one. But I think that because when I'm listening to Maisie, I feel like it's almost like, sorry, not to be cheesy, but like almost like a star child quality here. And that I'm very interested in, very taken by. And I think it reminds me of a couple of other women, or maybe around your age, detransitioners. And the fact, and they describe very similar things. One described her life as she felt like she was drowning in tar. Another one talked about being the product of LGBTQ science because she was an artificial insemination pregnancy as to a single mom. And these new family formations and this new cultural environment that young people were growing up in, those of you who find some kind of spiritual connection to see you out, to lead the way out of the madness side of it, I think have like a deeper connection. I'm not sure to what. Let's just say reality, but that's inadequate. Whereas Gen X, because we were like, this is how it is, and we were very bounded. We were very bounded by, again, reality, inadequate word. And as we grew older, I think it actually made us slightly defenseless in ways that I'm trying to figure out how to explain it exactly. Like, you know, we were kind of glib, and we sort of took things like sarcasm was a primary mode of being, an irony. Whereas you guys, and I think that was kind of boxed us out from maybe seeing these deeper spiritual levels. Certainly when we were young. Certainly when we were young. Now we're seeing it more because the world is falling apart around us, and we're like, oh shit, something's gone terribly wrong. So suddenly our antenna have kicked in, right? But again, we're a minority, you know that. But like you guys are having the spiritual awakening. How old are you? What decade are you in? Your 20s, your 30s?
I just turned 30 in February.
Okay, yeah. So you're having this spiritual process very young compared to it almost reminds me of like the saints in the Middle Ages who would have suffered. I don't mean this I don't mean this flattery. I don't mean to like blow smoke up your ass. Like I mean like saints who had, you know, terrible traumas inflicted upon their bodies and maintained this connection, that led them to another realm, I don't know. I'm trying to figure out what I'm saying, but do you know what I mean about how, yeah, how Gen X we were so like, you know, jaded and cynical and sarcastic. That was kind of a buttress against fads, maybe, but it's also a buttress against
Growth.
yes, thank you. There you go. Perfect.
Yeah, or challenging
You're
yourself.
removed and critique everything and make fun of it. You're not actually like vulnerable somehow.
You're not, yeah,
Yes.
you're not in the stream of life. It's always easier to be a critic than a doer. So I have a question for Maisie. So you've lived as a male and now you've returned to living female. Does one of these experiences feel more natural and true, for lack of a better word, to you?
I don't know if I would frame it that way necessarily. I don't know if I can exactly say yes or no. I might have to slightly reframe it. So part of the trickiness here is that I kind of feel like I was reincarnated, and that Jack, that was the name I had for a long, long time. Jack was almost like a different person. And now Mazy's a person, Jack's a person. And we have things in common. There's a Venn diagram, but there's also some really distinct differences. And detransition wasn't something I chose. So it almost felt like, I guess I could call it the great unraveling of the old way of being. And so all of it, in one way or another, was driven by this like underlying authenticity, but also just instincts. And so I think uh, when something affects you for that long in your life, from early childhood, it inevitably has a deep impact on how you're formed. So there's kind of a feedback loop. You can't separate the
Hmm.
peanut butter from the jelly. So a lot of parts of Jack are how I was. And I still have some of those traits to one degree or another. I almost look at it as Jack was like 95% of Maisie, and 5% was somehow like completely dormant and unconscious and unknown. And I suppose that was the way things happened because of my childhood. Because, like, what I've talked about today and what I've been thinking about is like a big picture kind of societal view of what's going on that causes transgenderism. Actually, is it something totally different? Maybe it's, maybe even focusing on transgenderism is a small pinpoint of a far bigger situation we're in the big macro picture. But the other thing I've been trying to work out is understanding what is transgenderism medically, biologically, etc., and what causes it. And unfortunately, I think the cause is more like a recipe of factors that kind of come together. So I think, at least if I'm trying to use myself as a case study, because that's where I'm going to have the most insight, I think that there are people that have a predisposition mentally that makes them feel more like the other gender, and it can happen from a young age. And which means then your self-perception is naturally like that. So that's part of like just how and who you are. Um, and that's one of the factors. So I guess if you're asking which one's more natural, I mean, not having this so I view transgenderism as a medical condition, and I've always have. And that's part of the reason I don't fit with LGBT culture, is that they started to change after I started transitioning, and they started to change with this whole idea trans is now an identity. It's not a medical condition. So it's a noun. It's who and what you are more than an adjective. And I think this is a really bad change. And this is actually extremely destructive and destabilizing to people's mental health. But what I've noticed is for people like me that viewed trans as a medical condition, that we tend to do better. We tend to become more stable. We become more grounded. We might end up becoming spiritual. I've actually met quite a few people who are transgender that were similar to me that are spiritual. So they go on quasi-similar journeys to me. So now that I don't have this condition, I don't suffer the way that I used to. And so I went on this long journey where there was always this thing I was experiencing physically that was like whole body encompassing. It might look like a mental illness to outside observers, but the internal experience is that it's viscerally physical because you have a set of instincts and like physical sensations that this is how my body is, or this is how it's supposed to be, and something is completely wrong. And so when I was very little, it felt like it was, horrifying, like I was going to kill me, and it was extremely painful.
Hmm.
So, uh, I guess it
That's
wasn't.
so
It,
interesting. You know what I think when you're saying that, Maisie, it reminds me a little bit of menopause in that something goes off in your body and it's just wrong. And you have this sense that and I don't know if this is everybody's experience with menopause, but I know it's a lot of people's, and it's certainly been mine going through this process. It's like there's this way in which things just feel wrong or feel off. And you keep looking for some switch to flip to get it back to where it's supposed to be. You have a sense of a baseline that's elusive. So that's interesting. Um,
I have a sense of turning into a werewolf or something with menopause.
do you?
I feel like I've returned to the wild.
Oh,
And it's
interesting.
it's a whole thing.
I'll have
Maisie,
what she's having.
Because I'm curious because you said the 95-5. How would you even slice it up now? What would you, how much is Mazy? Like, does that even make sense as a question?
Um, I'm not sure if I fully grasp it. It's so with my friends, especially like people who knew me as Jack for a long time previously, we'll just kind of refer to Jack or Maisie because it's just such a stark difference. And then it also kind of refers to different time periods, like
Mhm.
the before and the after, like, oh, this was the time period of my life when we were doing this versus that. And I guess the reason I broke down the percentage that way is I sort of had this perception that it was only a small part of myself that was missing, that had been shut down probably from a very, very young age. I don't know how young, because I never experienced some of the experiences I have now internally of
Oh.
like being feminine, personality wise, being able to express myself that way. Uh, and it also has to do with how you relate to other people. So that's part of what makes things sometimes feel hypergendered is like you're relating to other people and comparing this is how they come across. Oh, it's a really big, tall guy. It's like big and burly. Okay, now I feel like small and like extra feminine or whatever, all these like comparisons. And uh, I mean, when I was Jack, there was I just didn't know how to be a girl. That's like the shortest answer. I didn't know how to do it when I was like 5, and I'm like, okay, my mom's trying to force me to be this way. I don't know what she wants me to do. So then I would just like sit down in a chair and close my eyes and be like, okay, I'm gonna be a girl. And then like squeeze really hard, be like, okay, how do
Oh.
I didn't know how to do it. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. And
Hmm.
so it just seems like outside of any other external factors that may have been an influence, there was something internally, mentally, and physically going on in me.
Hmm.
And I wanted to bring up a couple of phrases here. I don't know if Leslie's heard of this as a therapist, but I heard these two concepts from Dr. K from Healthy Gamer. It's a really big psychology YouTube channel, and it's ego syntonic and ego dystonic.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Yeah. So for anyone who doesn't know, ego syntonic would be you see something in the world or you experience it and you automatically feel like it's part of you or it's like aligned with you, like mirror neurons or you empathize, whatever. You see someone have an experience, you relate to it like, oh, that's like me. Ego dystonic is a no, that's not like me. And when Jenny was talking about the Gen X experience, and I guess Leslie was too, but like, don't be a poser and you have to be authentic and don't be fake. Uh, it ironically sounded kind of fake to me. I'm sure it
Mhm.
was a genuine experience for a lot of people, but it seems a little bit paradoxical because I have a very close friend I've known 17 years. So he's one of the few people that's known me in all three phases. Before I was Jack, the name I was born with was Megan. I can't stand that name, so I didn't go back to it. And he knew me then, and he knew me as Jack, and now he knows me as Maisie. It's a very, very rare experience. The only other person who has lived through all three is my dad. So this friend of mine that I've known forever and ever, I think has a persona that is partially real and like a deeper form of who he is, and partially not. And that he's always kind of joking around and sarcastic. He's always floating, where he's not ever fully serious. It's rare to see him actually fully be serious. Um,
Oh, I'll mute you, Jenny. Okay.
And
Okay, so
I think his experience of that is that he's being completely genuine.
hmm,
And by not taking anything seriously, he's being completely genuine. So it's ego syntonic that that's who he is. But I don't think that's fully, like, it's not a fully self-actualized, self-realized personality. And there is a stage of growing up for a person through that experience where eventually you have to actually care about something. And caring about something to me is one of the most essential parts of being authentic. So I'm not a person that has to ever be sarcastic and constantly dismissive of things and never take anything seriously. I've always been a person that like deeply cares about things. And I noticed that some of the Gen X talk sounded like you have this outside perspective of like the millennial really caring about things as sometimes looking narcissistic.
Well, I
Mm.
think that I mean, you go back to like T.S. Eliot, this line from the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. And there's this whole concept in social psychology of self-monitoring and how if you're a high self-monitor or a low self-monitor, which basically means like how much am I paying attention to how I show up here and how much am I just engaging with the world. Like a high self-monitor is really reflecting a lot on themselves and how they're constructing a persona. A low self-monitor is low in that construction of persona and they're more engaged with people. And so I think that one of the things that's really interesting is with all the internet communication, like what we're doing right now, there's a screen with all of your faces on it, but my face is there too. And so there's much more reflection on the self because there's much more exposure to the idea of a self. And if you go back to before we were engaging in this way, go back along the trajectory of humanity and find places, you can find places of relative ease when a lot of the problems have been solved, and now we have room to reflect on what is a self. And so we can turn our problem-solving perfectionist tendencies toward the self and creating more of a self and thinking about what am I? But so much of life has been about how do I solve these basic fundamental problems? Think like Maslow's hierarchy. We're still working on these lower rungs. We don't get up to the self-actualization. And I think that some of that rejection of the mask or the costume was about a don't bullshit me. I just want to engage with who you are. I want you to be who you are, and I want to be who I am. And that creates kind of a lie because, of course, in that dynamic, everybody is trying really hard to perform their costume really authentically. So yeah, there's a shallowness in that, right? But I think that there's a part of all of this that feels so, I don't know, so abhorrent and disturbing because there's so much crafting of persona. So at some point, who are you even interacting with? You're just interacting with yourself. I mean, everybody just interacting with, a mirror, basically, which is essential narcissism. So I don't know, there's so many things left to explore and talk about on this. I know we're over time. Are you guys okay for like just wrapping this up, or does anybody have to immediately pull the plug?
I have to jump.
You have to jump.
Yeah, I kind of do as well.
Okay, so we'll wrap and we'll just say thank you so much, Mazy. This is super interesting. I feel like
Yes,
we could have
thank
talked
you.
for another hour.
Yes.
And people wanted to hear more from you, Jennifer. So maybe probe you
I
for
just mainly
your
have
insights.
questions.
Yeah. Well, Mazy, real quick before we hit end, where can people find you?
My YouTube channel is called A New Agora. That's A space New Agora. And if anyone was curious about the spiritual transformation in particular, I have a documentary on that called Touching the Source.
All right. Awesome. I'll put links in the description. And thank you all so much for joining us in the chat today. And we will see you